Hello, and welcome to Tears of Joy Creative. I'm sure by now you're wondering why I'm dancing around my sewing room with this gorgeous embroidered tulle skirt. I found it a few months ago at my local thrift store and fell madly in love with it, and I knew it would be the perfect thing to use in my next Pinterest-inspired remake. That's right, I'm going to turn this beautiful skirt into this dress I found on Pinterest. And I'm going to be using these two patterns to make it with. Now, I've made this pattern before. I made it for my daughter when she was getting married as her wedding dress, and I'm using it for the bodice. This dress I'm using for the lace overlay. And I think I should have enough fabric in this skirt to do it with. But first, I need to make a mock-up of the bodice before I can cut this apart. This bodice is very basic. It has a front, back, and side back. I've cut a size 12 and took in the sides just a bit. I'm wearing my bra because when the dress is done, I will be adding these push-up bust cups instead. I will be adding some sew-in boning to all the seams to give it some structure. I've also gone ahead and made a couple of mock-ups over the overlay out of some tulle. I like the way it fits and have plenty of arm movement. I just need to cut the shoulder seam out a bit more, but I think I'm ready to cut my skirt apart and cut my pattern. This skirt is made of 3 different layers: the embroidered tulle, a polyester satin layer, and a stretch knit lining that has some crinoline for fullness. I need approximately 23 inches of the top layer for the skirt of this dress. And before I cut that off, I've got to see if I actually have enough embroidered fabric for my 3 overlay pieces. I also need to make sure that I have an extra 3 inches to add to the bottom of the pattern of the overlay for the length of my bodice. And it looks like I'm good to go and will have just enough fabric for my dress. I'm super excited to see this dress come together. I really like the boat neckline on the front and have always wanted a dress like this. I'm also cutting down the crown of the sleeve so it's not so gathered at the top. And I was well aware that there was not enough fabric to make a long sleeve, but that's okay because I actually want them to just come to my elbow. I cut the satin lining for the skirt a ½ inch shorter than the top layer, and I have just enough fabric for my bodice pieces once I cut away the extra sizes. Yes, I'm one of those sewists that like to cut their patterns. It takes away any temptation to make anything for anyone else. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I hate polyester with a passion, but hey, the matching burgundy crinoline makes up for it. And I'm cutting this layer a ½ inch shorter than the satin layer. I did think I was not going to have enough fabric to use for the lining of the bodice, and I really wasn't sure I wanted to use this stretch knit as my lining. But this is an upcycled project, so I'm using what I have. To sew the bodice together, I start by sewing the center front to the side front by lining up the 2 bust markings. Now, on most bodice patterns, you would sew a row of stay stitching to the center front seam allowance between these 2 markings, and then clip the seam allowance a bit to accommodate for the bust curve on the side front. My fabric has a bit of stretch, so my seams lined up nicely without doing that. Next, I sew the side back and the center back seams together. Now, I know you can see that I have sewn boning to the seam allowance, but we will talk more about that later because I didn't like the way I sewed it on the first time. But yes, now that the bodice pieces are sewn together, this is when you would sew the boning to the seam allowance. And after working with wedding dresses for many years, I did not do the one thing that I always did when adding boning to a dress, and that was to wrap the ends with ribbon so the plastic ends don't poke through the fabric. Boning is a great way to give any bodice some structure, and you always want to sew it to the outer layer. Now it's time to sew the bodice lining to the front at the top edge. Then trim a ¼ inch or so off the seam allowance and sew a row of understitching on the lining. It's time to move on to the overlay, and I'm starting with the sleeves. I'm finishing all my seams with a French seam. A French seam, if you did not know, is when you sew the wrong sides of the fabric together first, sewing a skinny 1/4 inch down the seam allowance. You press the seam to one side, then press the sewn seam together and stitch 3/8 inch down the seam allowance to enclose the raw edge. And here's what the rest of the overlay looks like. The sleeves were not that challenging. You just have to sew around them twice, as with all the seams. If you don't want to sew French seams, you could just serge them off if you like, or just leave them plain with a cut edge. No matter what, you're going to see these seams through this type of fabric. So I have temporarily tacked in these bust cups because it is time for a fitting. And I think this fits pretty well, except for the fact that the boning sticks up way too high, mainly because there's a lot of stretch in these fabrics. So I'm going to have to shorten them. Otherwise, this looks pretty good. As far as the overlay goes, I think it fits okay. I like the neckline and the length of it. It feels a bit scratchy, and I'll be the first to admit it's taking me a minute to get used to that. So I'm going to pin the two layers together before taking it off. The first thing I did was to sew the overlay to the bodice at the center back. I've also opened up the lining at the top because I'm going to put in a zipper in the back, and I will hand sew this in place later. Now, when sewing any kind of zipper into netting or tulle fabric like this, you have to ease the fabric onto the zipper because it is stretchy, and if you pull the fabric too tight, your zipper will warp or bow out. So be sure to have the fabric a bit loose and let the feed dogs push it along under the zipper. Second fitting, and no, I have not shortened the boning yet. The zipper is laying nicely. I just feel like the netting is not sitting right at all. I think part of the problem is that the bodice is too long and causing it to push up, which makes the overlay bunch up and twist. So I have decided to shorten the bodice and marked where I want to attach the skirts. This is what the boning is supposed to look like with the ends wrapped, and I used a grosgrain ribbon to wrap them. I have moved the strips down from the top slightly so they won't stick out, and shortened them to just above where I will attach the skirts. I'm sewing the seam allowances together on the inside of each seam to keep the stretch knit lining from showing. This mannequin does fit me. I measured it and it's pretty good for the size. I have shortened the bodice 1 1/4 inches. I have decided that there needs to be a dart here in the overlay part in order for it to sit without twisting to the back. It's not going to line up on the side seams, but that's beyond me at this point. So what I've done is I've put a dart here in the front, and I think that's going to help make it fit overall. And I have the measurement for where my zipper needs to go. This fits just right across my midsection. Before I trim all this off, I'm going to go ahead and put the darts in, try it on one more time, and then I will cut this off and start adding on the skirts. To mark the darts, I first mark each pin on the fold with a safety pin. Then I write down the amount to be taken in and remove the straight pins. Turn the overlay inside out. I did check to see if they were roughly symmetrical from side to side, and they seem to be, and mark each spot with a safety pin. So now I can fold the fabric and sew in the darts. And I'm sure you can tell by my face that I am much happier with the way this is fitting. I was right to sew in the darts in the overlay and shorten the bodice. To sew on the skirts, I'm starting with sewing the crinoline layer to the lining of the bodice. I have sewn 2 rows of gathering stitches at the top and open up the center back seam for the zipper. I've also decided to cut off the top layer of polyester fabric that is on top of the crinoline because it's an extra layer I don't need and will be too bulky for the dress. To attach it to the lining, I just pull the gathering stitches and sew it on. I will tell you that the first time I sewed this layer on, it was inside out and I had to take it off, flip it over, and sew it on a second time. And basically, the embroidered and satin skirt layers are done the same way, with sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches, pulling the threads to gather them up, and then sewing them on to the bodice. To finish off the bottom of an invisible zipper, you sew down one side at the bottom just past the skirt opening. Close the bottom of the zipper about 2 inches and lay the other side of the fabric on top. Reach to the inside and pin the zipper to the seam allowance. Unzip the zipper, pushing the pull tab through the opening. Now stitch down the other side of the zipper, then push the zipper tab through the bottom and zip. So if you want a detailed tutorial on how to sew in an invisible zipper, click the link in the description below. What I am going to do to finish the zipper is a technique sewn in many sheer dresses I have altered before, and that is to make the zipper look skinnier. You do that by sewing the sheer fabric to the edge of the zipper tape and then trim off any extra fabric. Fold over the tape end and stitch it in place. Then fold over the zipper tape and sew it down next to the teeth. This gives the zipper a nice finished look. Now I can hand sew the lining to the inside of the bodice and skirt. I am also hand tacking the waist together on the inside across the front from side to side. This is something that you don't have to do, but I feel it helps keep the gathered seam allowances pointed upward toward the bodice. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I was going to make these sleeves elbow length, but after finishing the dress and trying it on, I've decided that I actually like the 3/4 length sleeves, or whatever the length is on the sleeves that they are now. And so I'm sewing a 1/4 inch double turned hem on the end. One last thing I am adding is a set of ribbon hangers at the side seams. This dress is basically strapless with a very fragile tulle overlay, and I don't want to hang this from the overlay on the hanger. So all you do is take a 12 to 15 inch piece of ribbon, fold it in half, fold the ends under, and tack it to the side seams. And I usually catch the boning when I sew it on. And now I do believe that my dress is finished. I'm wearing this for my 20th wedding anniversary, but that's not for 2 weeks. And I really want to get this video posted before then. So it's time for the photo shoot. Well, I can't begin to tell you how thrilled I am at how this dress came out, and I am super excited to wear this on my anniversary. My husband and I are celebrating 20 years on February 11th, and we still have no clue where we're going out to dinner. So there are a couple things about this dress that I did not mention in the video. One is a better explanation about sewing in these bust cups. As you can see, I have them sewn here at the top and bottom, and that's really all you need. And the placement of these really isn't that hard to figure out. The bust point of the cup goes at the bust point of the dress. Secondly, I have added some detail to the overlay because it was a little bare in certain areas. And I had some leftover fabric that I used to cut out some of these motifs. I added this piece here, the little flowers here. I also took in the shoulder area with a 1/4 inch dart. I did not want to take this seam apart. And I added a leaf on both sides to cover that up. And also, when I was trying this on the other night, my husband said, hey, there's a hole in the back of the tool. And so up here at the top, somehow I managed right next to the zipper to put a hole in it. But I sewed this flower on, which matches this one, and it covers it up. And I didn't have to take the zipper apart, and there's no way I was going to do that. And I think it looks really nice. I also did cut a little bit out of the front neckline, just scooped it out just a little bit, and I like the way it lays against my neck a lot better. And finally, I wanted to talk about the cost to make this dress. Now, the original skirt that I got was on sale, 50% off at my local thrift store. It started out at $14.99, which means I got it for $7.50. I had no other materials in it except for the bust cups and a zipper, but those things I already owned. I have a lot of supplies left over from my alteration business. And I knew when I saw that dress hanging on the rack that I was going to be able to make this dress that I had found on Pinterest. And I think I did a pretty good job at making my own version of this dress from something I thrifted to make something that looks very expensive. So please, keep your thrift store in mind when it comes to your next sewing project. It's a great resource for clothing, for materials, for fabric, for lots of things. And so I hope this video inspired you in some way or another. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel as the sewing madness continues.